Okay, it's day 2 of Unit 4. Today is focused on what happened when Japan expanded its empire across Asia and the Pacific. Here we have our map from before, but now we've shifted focus to the Pacific Ocean. We're going to talk about Japan today. It conquered Korea, Manchuria, and part of China in our previous classes. And today we're going to talk about how it started to take over these other areas. So the question is, what happened at Pearl Harbor and why? Japan's goal was to take over all of these areas down here in the southern, western sort of Pacific area, the Pacific Islands. One big focus was Indonesia, and another big focus was the Philippines. Japan knew that if they just invaded these places, the U.S. was likely to come to their defense. So, in a quick knockout blow, preemptive attack, Japan decided to bomb Pearl Harbor. Well, more accurately, the Japanese military and navy decided to bomb Pearl Harbor. They saw this as a way to prevent the U.S. from fighting back and for buying themselves some time to conquer all those other places. The theory was that if Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and took out as much of our navy as they could, the U.S. would be so defeated by this that we would give in and just sort of let them do whatever they wanted. Or if we decided to retaliate, it would take us so long to rebuild our navy that they would have conquered all the places they wanted to conquer by the time we caught up. What happened? So Pearl Harbor this is a photo of it from the air from before the bombing, and here's the little tiny opening. It's a really great harbor. It's very protected. There's islands inside it. So you want to think like if you've been to San Francisco Bay. It's a big giant bay, but with giant islands instead of just little Alcatraz. It's got an island in the middle with an airfield on it even. Pearl Harbor was a Navy base, and the U.S. had accumulated most of its ships on this in this one base. The Pearl Harbor base is right in the middle, pretty much, of the Pacific Ocean, and so it's a good place to deploy the Navy from. So if you base most of your sailors in Pearl Harbor, you can pretty quickly access any of the other U.S. places in the Pacific. The U.S. had already moved most of its ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific, anticipating some kind of Japanese attack, but we didn't know when or how or when it was coming. This attack caught the U.S. completely off guard for several reasons, many of which are well understood. One of those is that the Japanese ambassadors, were still negotiating with officials in Washington for peace between the countries. And in the middle of the peace negotiations, the bombing happens. So it catches the U.S. off guard, partially because why would the country be negotiating for peace while at the same time plotting to attack? It's a pretty dirty trick. It's pretty devious. It's pretty sneaky. Also, radar was a fairly new technology, and radar operators at Pearl Harbor identified the airplanes coming in that would later drop bombs on the harbor itself, but they misidentified those airplanes as U.S. planes returning from a training mission. So those two things combined means that the attack was well underway before we even realized it was happening. The harbor is really well defensible against a naval attack, so we had thought that most of our ships would be safe there. The harbor is also relatively shallow, so lots of torpedoes and other kinds of standard weapons would be useless against our ships in this harbor. What we didn't account for is that Japan had modified their torpedoes so they would work on a shallow bay. The Japanese aircraft carriers, which we didn't factor in. This is the first war that aircraft carriers they play a big part. And Japanese aircraft carriers, you can see in this map here, sailed from Japan all the way over to near the Hawaiian Islands. Then from those aircraft carriers, Japanese planes took off, bombed the island, returned to the aircraft carrier, and then sailed home. We didn't plan on an air attack because the islands are so far out in the middle of the ocean. We didn't really think about aircraft carriers as being a sort of mobile strategic force in the way that after World War II, we would well know that they would be, that would be a huge advantage. Let's see. As a result of 2 hours of bombing and 2 waves of Japanese planes attacking, 19 ships were damaged, 8 of them battleships. Over 2,000 sailors were killed. Over 1,000 were seriously wounded. There were a couple of dozen civilians among there, and in response, the U.S. declares war. Roosevelt calls it an unprovoked attack, and he doesn't so much declare war as say a state of war has already existed between our countries. Basically, Japan started it. It was an attack by 350 Japanese aircraft and 65 support ships at the same exact time. There was supposed to be Japanese submarine attacks, but those didn't pan out. But even though the attack was not as catastrophic as it could have been, and it wasn't as catastrophic as it was even planned to be, it still did serious damage to the US fleet. Number 2, why and how did Japanese troops conquer large areas of Asia and the Pacific Islands between December 1941 and mid-1942? So let's talk about the why first and then the how. The why is to get resources. I told you that Japan was focused on these Pacific islands down here, the Indonesian islands, Borneo, the Philippines, sort of this area of the ocean and all the islands in it. The major resource they were interested in these locations was oil, petroleum, stuff like that. Oil, petroleum, gas, all the stuff that would make machines go. And also secondarily, in some of these islands, rubber for industrial use. This next thing is why then did Japan concern itself with Midway Island, Wake Island, Guam, these smaller islands out here in the ocean? And the answer for that is supply depots, stopping points for ships, supply stations, sources of water, food, gas, medical attention, things like that. These islands were useful for the U.S. as stopping places. The U.S. used them like our Navy would leave Hawaii and stop at Midway, stop at Wake Island, stop at Guam on our way to and from the Philippines. So taking over these islands not only would give Japan supply locations, but it would take away those supply bases from the U.S. These little tiny islands are small. They're full of, relatively peaceful populations. They're not fortresses in and of themselves, and so they were conquered pretty easily by the Japanese troops. The how of how they were conquered, they pretty easily surrender because they realize they don't have any reinforcements coming. Usually these places would be defended by the U.S., but these islands, and these are photos from nowadays, Midway, Wake Island, Guam, places like that, normally would be defended by the U.S. Navy. In Hawaii, however, the U.S. Navy was just taken out. Within the same 24-hour period of time, all of these places were attacked. So Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, Midway Island, and Hawaii were all attacked within the same sort of 48 hours. So if the U.S. had been able to respond, maybe we would have, but we couldn't because basically the entire Navy was bottled up in Hawaii and Pearl Harbor under attack. The Philippine Islands had some forces, and they did fight back a little bit harder than these other places, but they too relied on backup from Hawaii. So even though they're going to fight for a long time, they're not going to end up succeeding. This whole thing is part of the Japanese plan of Asia for the Asiatics. This is the idea that Japan has more of a right to own these places than, say, the US or the British or the Dutch or any other sort of European powers. Japan wanted these places as its own colonies. They thought that Asian people should control Asian places. However, they weren't there to liberate the people of, say, the Philippines or Hong Kong. They were there to colonize them themselves, and very quickly the people who lived in these places realized it doesn't matter who your colonial overlord is or what race they are. If they're your colonial overlord and they are brutal, military controlling people, it's not going to be good for you. This brings us to our last and final question. What happened to the U.S. colony, the Philippines? So the biggest target on that one 24-hour period of attack was the Philippines. Japanese troops fought the U.S. and Filipino forces on the island for at least 3 months. The U.S. Filipino troops fought valiantly and retreated a number of times. Eventually, as you can see here, retreating down Luzon to this tiny little peninsula of Bataan. Here's a zoomed-in picture of the Bataan Peninsula. They retreated further and further and further down the peninsula. Eventually, finding themselves cornered here at the tip of the peninsula. Some members of the Philippine government retreated to this tiny little island as a last-ditch effort. But pretty much the military here was surrounded and captured. The Japanese military took 76,000 prisoners. About 12,000 of them were American. The rest were Filipino. They surrendered because they had no more ability to fight, no more ammunition, no more supplies, and no supplies were coming because the U.S. fleet was being rebuilt in Hawaii. So they surrendered, and they surrendered their weapons, and they were held, and then they were marched for a 5 to 12-day journey to prison camps. 50 miles up the peninsula to prison camps where they were treated to incredibly inhumane conditions. Out of the 76,000 prisoners who started this march, otherwise known as the Bhutan Death March, only 54,000 survived. Along the way, they were tortured by being left out in the sun. They were tortured by being denied water or food. The water in their canteens was taken and given to horses along the way. There's a story told by Lieutenant Colonel William Dias after he and his fellow soldiers ended up in the prison camp. He later escaped and told his story. He and 3 other prisoners escaped. After they arrived at the camp at San Fernando, the conditions continued to be terrible. It was crowded. There was illness. There was dysentery. There was filth on the ground, maggots everywhere, dead bodies that weren't buried. And food was distributed unevenly so as to torture people even more. Soldiers who fell down on the death march along the way were left where they fell, and the cleanup crew, as they went by, would bayonet them to death where they lay. It's a horrible, brutal example of the Japanese racial policy and the Japanese philosophy of Bushido, which was put into effect against the captives. The Japanese code, the military code, said it's better to die than to surrender. And so the U.S. and Filipino troops, by surrendering, had, in the eyes of their Japanese captors, surrendered all of their rights for being humans. If you surrender, you are no longer given rights as a person. All right, there's your 3 slides, and then you need to summarize what happened when Japan expanded its empire across Asia and the Pacific.